So we're up to chapter 5 in book the first. In chapter 5 we jump over to France. So far we've only been in England, but now we are headed over to France, and it's the wine shop. So a large cask of wine had been dropped and broken in the street. The accident had happened in getting it out of a cart. The cask had tumbled out with a run. The hoops had burst, and it lay on the stones just outside the door of the wine shop, shattered like a walnut shell. So imagine one of those huge barrels. I don't really know what they're called. It's like those just huge barrels that have the rings around like the middle and the top and the bottom. That's what it would be. So it was filled with wine, and it breaks on the cobblestone streets. All the people within reach had suspended their business of their idleness to run to the spot and drink the wine. The rough, irregular stones of the street, pointing every way and designed, one might have thought expressly to lame all the living creatures that approached them, had dammed it into little pools. These were surrounded, each by its own jostling group or crowd according to its size. Some men kneeled down, made scoops of their 2 hands joined, and sipped, or tried to help women who bent over their shoulders to sip before the wine had all run out between their fingers. Others, men and women, dipped in the puddles with little mugs of mutilated earthenware, or even with handkerchiefs from women's heads, which were squeezed dry into infants' mouths, made other small mud embankments to stem the wine as it ran. Others, directed by lookers-on, up at high windows, darted here and there to cut off little streams of wine that started away in new directions. Others devoted themselves to the sodden and lee-dyed pieces of the cask, licking and even champing the moister, wine-rotted fragments with eager relish. There was no drainage to carry off the wine, and not only did it all get taken up, but so much wine got taken up along with it that there might have been a scavenger in the street, if anybody acquainted with it could have believed in such a miraculous presence. So, the fact that people are drinking wine off a disgusting street that's filled with mud and whatever else obviously suggests that they're incredibly desperate. If you are really wealthy, you would just get another barrel of wine and drink it, in a glass. But if you're poor and you have nothing, you're going to go and not mind drinking it off the ground just because of that desperation. So that's really important to keep in mind. We're in a poorer section of Paris. A shrill sound of laughter and of amused voices of men, women, and children, resounded in the street while this wine game lasted. So the use of the word game obviously suggests that this is like fun and out of the ordinary for these people. There was little roughness in the sport and much playfulness. There was special companionship in it, an observable inclination on the part of everyone to join one another, which led especially among the luckier or lighter-hearted to frolicsome embraces. I gotta put my lights on. When the wine was gone and the places where it had been abundant were raked into a gridiron pattern by fingers, these demonstrations ceased as suddenly as they had broken out. The man who had left his saw sticking in the firewood what he was cutting set it in motion again. The woman who had left on a doorstep the little pot of hot ashes at which she had been trying to soften the pain in her own starved fingers and toes, or in those of her child, returned to it. Men with bare arms, matted locks, and cadavers like a dead body, faces, who had emerged into the winter light from cellars, moved away to descend again, and a gloom gathered on the scene that appeared more natural to it than sunshine. So, while the wine lasts, everybody's happy, they're playing this wine game, and then it all disappears and they go back to their miserable, brutal lives. This is really important. So, the wine was red wine and had stained the ground of the narrow street in the suburb of St. Antoine in Paris where it was spilled. It had stained many hands, too, and many faces, and many naked feet, and many wooden shoes. The hands of the man who sawed the wood left red marks on the billets, and the forehead of the woman who nursed her baby was stained with the stain of the old rag she wound about her head. Those who had been greedy with the staves of the cast had acquired a tigerish smear about the mouth, and one tall joker, so besmirched, his head more out of a long, squalid bag of a nightcap than in it, scrawled upon the wall with his finger dipped in a muddy wine-lees blood. So everybody goes back to their lives, but the thing is about red wine is it's stained. So it stained their mouths, it stained their hands. And a man even goes and dips his finger in the wine and he writes blood on the wall. So obviously we're supposed to be thinking about blood here. And then this is incredibly important. So it says the time was to come when that wine too would be still spilled on the stone streets, and when the stain of it would be read upon many there. So in this instance, wine is a symbol for blood, and we're talking about foreshadowing the French Revolution. And now that the cloud settled on Saint Antoine, so this is the part of France that we're in, it's a section of Paris, so Saint Antoine, which a momentary gleam had driven from his sacred countenance, the darkness of it was heavy. Cold, dirt, sickness, ignorance, and want were the lords in waiting on the saintly presence, nobles of great power, all of them, but especially the last, samples of a people that had undergone a terrible grinding and regrinding in the mill, and certainly not in the fabulous mill which ground old people young, shivered at every corner, passed in and out at every doorway, looked from every window, fluttered in every vestige of a garment that the wind shook. The mill which had worked them down was the mill that grinds young people old. The children had ancient faces and grave voices upon them, and upon the grown faces, and plowed into every furrow of age and upcoming afresh was the sign, hunger. It was prevalent everywhere. Hunger was pushed out of the tall houses in the wretched clothing and hung upon poles and lines. Hunger was patched into them with straw and rag and wood and paper. Hunger was repeated in every fragment of the small modicum of firewood that the man sawed off. Hunger stared down from the smokeless chimneys, and stared up from the filthy street that had no offal among its refuse or anything to eat. Hunger was the inscription on the baker's shelves, written in every small loaf of his scanty stock of bad bread at the sausage shop, in every dead dog preparation that was offered for sale. Hunger rattled its dry bones among the roasting chestnuts that turned in the cylinder. Hunger was shred into atomies in every farthing porringer of husky chips of potato, fried with some reluctant drops of oil. So obviously the word hunger gets repeated over and over again. It's a capital H. It's as if hunger is another character in this book. He's personifying this idea of hunger, and we know that that's one of the reasons that the revolution occurred, is people were so hungry, and then that contrasted with people who were incredibly wealthy. I'm going to skip some of this paragraph. So again, it's everything is depicted in like with wanting, so there's not enough of anything, except if you go down on 29, it says nothing was represented in a flourishing condition save, which means except, tools and weapons, but the cutler's knives and axes were sharp and bright, the smith's hammers were heavy, and the gunmaker's stock was murderous. The crippling stones of the pavement, with their many little reservoirs of mud and water, had no footways, but broke off abruptly at the doors. The kennel, to make amends, ran down the middle of the street, when it ran at all, which was only after heavy rains, and then it ran, by many eccentric fits, into the houses. Across the streets, at wide intervals, one clumsy lamp was slung by a rope, and pulley at night, when the lamplighter had let these down and lighted and hoisted them up again. A feeble grove of dim wicks swung in a sickly manner overhead, as if they were at sea. Indeed, they were at sea, and the ship and crew were in peril of tempest. So tempest is a storm. Okay, so then we're going to jump down a little bit on 30 to the middle, where it says the wine shop was a corner shop. So this is where the wine spilled, is at this shop. The wine shop was a corner shop, better than most others in its appearance and degree, and the master of the wine shop had stood outside it in a yellow waistcoat and green breeches, looking on at the struggle for the lost wine. "It's not my affair," said he, with a final shrug of his shoulders. "The people from the market did it. Let them bring another." There his eyes happened to catch the tall joker writing up his joke. He called to him across the way, "Say then, my Gaspard, what do you do there?" So Gaspard is the man that wrote blood on the wall. The fellow pointed to his joke with immense significance, as is often the way with his tribe. It missed its mark, and completely failed, as is often the way with his tribe too. "What now, are you subject for the mad hospital?" said the wine shop keeper, crossing the road and obliterating the jest with a handful of mud, picked up for that purpose, and smeared over it. "Why do you write in the public streets? Is there, tell me thou, is there no other place to write such words in?" In his expostulation, he dropped his cleaner hand, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not, upon the joker's heart. The joker rapped it with his own, took a nimble spring upward, and came down in a fantastic dancing attitude with one of his stained shoes jerked off into his foot, and held it out. A joker of an extremely, not to say wolfishly practical character, he looked under those circumstances. Put it on, said the other. "Call, wine, and finish there." With that advice, he wiped his soiled hand upon the joker's dress, such as it was quite deliberately, as having dirtied the hand on his account, and then recrossed the road and entered the wine shop. So here's who these people are. So the wine shop keeper was a bull-necked, martial-looking man of 30, and he should have been of hot temperament, for although it was a bitter day, he wore no coat, but carried one slung over his shoulder. His shirt sleeves were rolled up too, and his brown arms were bare to the elbows. Neither did he wear anything more on his head than his own crisply curling short dark hair. He was a dark man altogether, with good eyes and a good bold breath between them. Good-humored looking on the whole, but implacable looking too. Evidently a man of strong resolution and a set purpose. A man not desirable to be met, rushing down a narrow pass with a gulf on either side, for nothing would turn the man. So you should write down that his name is Monsieur Defarge. And now here is his wife. Madame Defarge, his wife, sat in the shop behind the counter as he came in. Madame Defarge was a stout woman of about his own age, with a watchful eye that seldom seemed to look at anything. A large hand heavily ringed, a steady face, strong features, and great composure of manner. There was a character about Madame Defarge from which one might have predicted that she did not often make mistakes against herself in any of the reckonings over which she presided. Madame Defarge, being sensitive to cold, was wrapped in fur and had a quantity of bright shawl twined about her head, though not to the concealment of her large earrings. Her knitting was before her, and she had laid it down to pick her teeth with a toothpick. Thus engaged, with her right elbow supported by her left hand, Madame Defarge said nothing when her lord came in, but coughed, just one grain of cough. This, in combination with the lifting of her darkly defined eyebrows over her toothpick by the breath of a line, suggested to her husband that he would do well to look around the shop among the customers for any new customer who had dropped in while she stepped over the way. So Defarge walks into the shop from erasing the word blood off of the wall, and Madame Defarge sort of does this, as if to signal him to look around the shop because there's somebody new that is inside the shop. So on the bottom of 31 it says, the wine shop keeper accordingly rolled his eyes about until they rested upon an elderly gentleman and a young lady. So this is Laurie and Lucy. Other company were there, 2 playing cards, 2 playing dominoes, 3 standing up by the counter. So there's other people in the shop. Defarge comes in, jumping down a little bit, and said, "How goes it, Jacques?" said one of the 3 to Monsieur Defarge. "Is all the spilt wine swallowed?" "Every drop, Jacques," answered Monsieur Defarge. With this interchange of Christian name was effected. Madame Defarge, picking her teeth with her toothpick, coughed another grain of cough and raised her eyebrows by the breath of another line. So she's sort of like, and notice that the 2 men both refer to each other as Jacques. So Jacques is a code name. They don't want to, in mixed company, use their real names, so they just use a common name like Mike or John or something like that. Think about why they would be secretive. Think about what the wine shop is. And think about why Defarge would have been upset about the word blood being written on the wall right outside. It is not often, said the second of the 3, addressing Monsieur Defarge, that many of these miserable beasts know the taste of wine, or anything but black bread and death. Is it not so, Jacques? It is so, Jacques, Monsieur Defarge returned. At this second interchange of the Christian name, Madame Defarge, still using her toothpick, with profound composure, coughed another grain of cough, and raised her eyebrows by the breath of another line. The last of the 3 now said his say as he put down his empty drinking vessel and smacked his lips. So they continue to talk. And I'm jumping over to 33. These men leave. Okay, so it says on 33, they paid for their wine and left the place. The eyes of Monsieur Defarge were studying his wife at her knitting when the elderly gentleman, advancing from his corner, begged a favor of a word. Willingly, sir, said Monsieur Defarge, and quietly stepped with him to the door. Their conference was very short, but very decided. Almost at the first word, Monsieur Defarge started and became deeply attentive. It had not lasted a minute when he nodded and went out. The gentleman then beckoned to the young lady, and they, too, went out. Madame Defarge knitted with nimble fingers and steady eyebrows and saw nothing. So you're going to see that over and over Madame Defarge gets described as seeing nothing, but it's clear, based on her behavior, based on the eyebrows, based on the cough that she's doing to kind of warn her husband, that she sees everything. Mr. Jarvis Lorry and Miss Manette, emerging from the wine shop thus, joined Monsieur Defarge in the doorway to which he had directed his other company just before. It opened from a stinking little black courtyard, and was the general public entrance to a great pile of houses. So they're going up to where Dr. Manette is kept. So they leave the wine shop and they go up to these like little apartments that are up on top of the shops. It's very high and it's a little difficult. Better to begin slowly. Thus, Monsieur Defarge in a stern voice to Mr. Lorry as they began ascending the stairs. Is he alone? The latter whispered. Alone? God help him. Who should be with him? Said the other in the same low voice. Is he always alone then? Yes. Of his own desire? Of his own necessity? As he was when I first saw him, after they found me and demanded me to know if I could take him, and at my peril be discreet, as he was then, so he is now. He is greatly changed? Changed. The keeper of the wine shop stopped to strike the wall with his hand and mutter a tremendous curse. So they keep climbing up the stairs, and it's this long way up, and so they keep going. And obviously, as they continue to climb, Lucy is getting more and more anxious or apprehensive. At the bottom of 34, it says, At last the top of the staircase was gained, and they stopped for a third time. Yet there was an upper staircase of a steeper inclination and of contracted dimensions to be ascended, before the garret story was reached. The keeper of the wine shop, always going a little in advance, and always going on the side which Mr. Lorry took, as though he dreaded to be asked any questions by the young lady, turned himself about here, and carefully feeling in the pockets of his coat he carried over his shoulder, took out a key. The door is locked, then, my friend? Said Mr. Lorry, surprised. Yes, was the grim reply of Monsieur Defarge. You think it necessary to keep the unfortunate gentleman so retired? I think it necessary to turn the key. Monsieur Defarge whispered it closer in his ear and frowned heavily. Why? Why? Because he has lived so long locked up that he would be frightened, rave, tear himself to pieces, die, come to I know not what harm, if the door was left open. Is it possible? Exclaimed Mr. Lorry. Is it possible? Repeated Defarge bitterly. Yes, and a beautiful world we live in when it is possible, and when many other such things are possible. So they keep talking. Mr. Lorry is telling Lucy to have courage. Obviously, it's weird that the door is kept locked. And at the bottom of 35, it says, They went up slowly and softly. The staircase was short, and they were soon at the top. There, as it had an abrupt turn in it, they came all at once in sight of the three men whose heads were bent down close together at the side of the door, and who were intently looking into the room of which the door belonged. So these are the three guys who were in the wine shop that went out one at a time, and so they're now up, and they're looking through these little holes in the wall in at Dr. Manette, which is obviously super weird. Through some chinks or holes in the wall, on hearing footsteps close at hand, these three turned and rose and showed themselves to be the three of the name who had been drinking in the wine shop. I forgot them in surprise of your visit, exclaimed Monsieur Defarge. Leave us, good boys, we have business here. The three glided by and went silently down. There appearing to be no other door on that floor, and the keeper of the wine shop going straight to this one, when they were left alone, Mr. Lorry asked him in a whisper, with a little anger, Do you make a show of Monsieur Manette? I show him, in the way you have seen, to a chosen few. Is that well? I think it is well. Who are the chosen few? How do you choose them? I choose them as real men of my name. Jacques is my name, to whom the sight is likely to do good. Enough, you are English. There is another thing. Stay there, if you please, a little moment. With an admonitory gesture to keep them back, he stooped and looked in through the crevice in the wall. Soon, raising his head again, he struck twice or thrice upon the door, evidently with no other object than to make a noise there. With the same intention, he drew the key across it 3 or 4 times before he put it clumsily into the lock and turned it as heavily as he could. The door slowly opened inward under his hand, and he looked into the room and said something. A faint voice answered something. Little more than a single syllable could have been spoken on either side. He looked back over his shoulder and beckoned them to enter. I'm afraid of it, Lucy answered, shuddering. Of it? What? I mean of him, of my father. Rendering in a manner desperate by her state and by the beckoning of their conductor, he drew over his neck the arm that shook upon his shoulder, lifted her a little, and hurried her into the room. Defarge drew out the key, closed the door, and locked it on the inside, took out the key again, and held it in his hand. All this he did methodically, and with as loud and harsh an accompaniment of noise as he could make. Finally, he walked across the room with a measured tread to where the window was. He stopped there and faced around. The garret, built to be a depository for firewood and the like, was dim and dark, for the window of dormer shape was in truth a door in the roof with a little crane over it for the hoisting up of stores from the street. unglazed and closing up the middle in two pieces like any other door of French construction. To exclude the cold, one half of this door was fast closed, and the other was opened but a very little way. Such a scanty portion of light was admitted through these means that it was difficult on first coming in to see anything, and long habit alone could have slowly formed in anyone the ability to do any work requiring nicety in such obscurity. Yet work of that kind was being done in the garret, for with his back toward the door and his face toward the window, where the keeper of the wine shop stood looking at him, a white-haired man sat on a low bench, stooping forward and very busy making shoes. So here's Dr. Manette. He's in this room. All the circumstances surrounding it are really weird, and he's sitting there and he's making shoes. And this is the room that he is kept locked in. So that's it for chapter 5.